Hi there, Anna.
Hey Shay, how's it going?
It's going well. I've been busy ramping up for the TESOL International Convention later this month.
Oh
I imagine
yeah.
you have too.
Yes, so busy. This episode is coming out a week late.
Yeah, sorry, listeners. You're all right,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, but it's exciting, right? The prospect of going to TESOL.
Yes. Plus, we'll be sharing about the podcast journey at TESOL on Friday, March 25th at 4:30 p.m.
Yep, we'll be giving some tips on how to start your own podcast. Power to the people, right?
I love that. But if it doesn't interest you, we invite you also to meet us for coffee, 10 a.m. Friday morning, somewhere in the convention hotel. We'd love to see you there.
Yeah, get your caffeine fix with us.
Yeah.
We'll share the exact location on our social media accounts.
So, anyway, Anna, let's shift into our topic for today.
Okay, so today we're digging into implementing peer feedback in the classroom.
Let's do it.
Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Anna.
And I'm Shay. And today we're going to look at what makes for effective peer feedback in the language classroom.
So Shay, let's start by defining peer feedback. What are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, if you're unfamiliar, peer feedback is any activity in which you get students to provide feedback to one another
Right.
instead of feedback only coming from the teacher. This might happen when students are writing a draft of an essay, preparing for a presentation, or even prepping for an interview.
And so peer feedback or peer review is a pretty widely accepted practice, at least in the North American education context. But it isn't always obvious how to make it a worthwhile endeavor.
Totally. I've definitely tried to implement activities focused on peer feedback and ended up with a less than desirable outcome. The reality is, getting your students to provide feedback successfully is a bit more complex than just saying, hey, give your partner some feedback, right?
Yeah, there's a lot involved for sure, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah, so to give some background, peer review has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
What comes to mind right away is Lev Vygotsky and sociocultural theory. What year was that? 1978?
Yeah, 1978, so it's been a while, huh?
Yeah. So, in essence, according to Vygotsky, learning is a social process, not just cognitive. When it comes down to it, you can't have learning without some sort of interaction. Interacting or working with a teacher or a peer provides a form of support, the sort of built-in scaffolding.
Yeah.
Learning with help from others then allows students to be more autonomous in their own learning.
Now, when I think of sociocultural theory, the term that stands out to me that's been just drilled into my head is ZPD. Stands for Zone of Proximal Development.
A pretty scary term.
Yeah, it's a scary term, but for a pretty simple concept in the end. The zone of proximal development, ZPD, is basically that gap between what a learner can achieve with assistance and where they are right now. So adding that social element, adding some form of peer review, peer feedback, working with someone on something can have the effect of helping students to bridge that gap.
So it's this idea of putting learners together in order to challenge them to arrive at a higher level of output or production.
Yeah, exactly.
But also this idea of negotiating meaning, which comes from interactionist theories. It was Probst in 1989 who said, quote, "Without a reader, there's only potential for meaning, but no meaning itself," end quote. I think that really speaks to just how advantageous, arguably necessary, it can be to work alongside someone to negotiate meaning. I think that makes for more intentional writing, don't you?
Yeah, writing and also doing a presentation, any kind of spoken or written form, really. You know, I've worked in writing centers a lot in my career, and the perspective of an audience, having another person read or listen to and provide feedback on what you've written or said, it's just invaluable. Having another pair of eyes on something you create can really shed light on gaps in your messaging.
I mean, I'm of the view that this perspective taking is useful throughout the entire production process because in the end, you are doing something for an audience, right? So whether that's a fellow student or just the teacher, there's a benefit in having multiple perspectives during the creative process.
Right, but let's take a step back here. Vygotsky, Probst, these are good theorists with good theories, but when it comes to empirical research and the experiences we have in the classroom, we need to acknowledge that there are mixed results on whether peer review is effective or not.
Yeah, total mixed bag. Attitudes towards feedback from peers are mixed, and while some studies show a positive correlation between peer feedback and improved learning outcomes, others show that peer feedback has little or no effect on student learning.
Right. One common thread in the research, and one I've directly observed in my own classroom, is that students aren't always open to others' perspectives. They often are just focused on having the teacher give them feedback, and they don't always see the innate value in having their peers also read and revise their work. So many students have told me, especially when I first started experimenting with peer feedback, like, this feedback is useless. I'm just going to wait for your comments, teacher.
No.
They think that maybe their peers are not as capable of giving effective feedback as their instructors are.
And so that's something that we're kind of asking teachers and asking our students to break away from, right? This misconception that only the teacher is able to give feedback that's helpful. And I think that part of achieving that is ensuring that students have the tools they need to be effective conveyors of feedback. We have to teach them not only how to review critically, but also create messaging that's helpful. Students have their opinions and often these really interesting perspectives to share, but that's not something that just happens, right? It's necessary for us to create some sort of structure, some sort of framework for students to work within.
And so the important element here is how peer review is implemented. Probably the clearest finding of the research we reviewed for this episode is that the way the peer review activity is implemented is the most important factor in making it beneficial for learners. The framework we provide has to hone the students' skills of looking at someone else's work and being able to recognize things that might not be working so well for their peer. This requires them to be attuned to the skill that they're learning and focusing on. And of course, while they're looking at someone else's work over time, they're actually building the skill of writing or doing a presentation of their own because they're seeing how someone else is doing it. And then they're able to critique it and be like, oh, well, I guess I would have done that differently.
Yes, there's this idea of transference that we're striving for. We want to build critical reviewers, but I think the primary goal is that after providing feedback, you're able to return to your own work and see it through the same critical lens, right?
Yeah.
How did we come up with a solution for my friend here? And how are we going to try to apply that solution to my own work?
Yeah, being a critical reviewer for someone else is just the stepping stone for being a critical reviewer of your own work. But just because it's a stepping stone doesn't mean that it's not important. I think a lot of times my students would get really frustrated because they're not receiving as good of feedback as they could, and they're like, we didn't fix my paper. But the process of the peer feedback itself was valuable in and of itself because they learned something about the skill that they're practicing by taking the time to think more deeply about someone else's work and then also their own work.
Actually, there's a piece of research from Lindstrom and Baker from 2009 that follows a group of students who, at the beginning of the term, were either deemed feedback givers or feedback receivers over the course of the semester. And so the givers focused on providing peer feedback, and the receivers focused on implementing the feedback that their peers gave them. And at the end of the term, it was not surprising that the givers were the ones who improved significantly more in their writing than those who were tasked with just receiving and implementing feedback. This study just perfectly speaks to this idea of transference.
Right. No, yeah, that's not surprising to me at all because, again, the point of peer review is about skill building. It's not about making the perfect paper and making the perfect presentation. It's about improving over time.
But let's face it, students don't always love the process, right? They
Nope.
want to come out, yeah, imagine that, right? They want to come out of an experience like that with feedback that will guide them in exactly the right direction. But I think this disappointment can be mitigated by pairing students appropriately. I think that a lot of teachers who have multi-level classes often have to contend with this idea of creating partnerships across proficiency levels. Should you place more advanced students with lower level students in this sort of peer review situation? I don't know.
That's such a tough question. I mean, it's not even just the level, but I also want to try to pair students whose temperament might match. Like one of the best pairings I've ever witnessed was these two students who were both fairly quiet but focused. They were so gentle with each other and got into a really deep, supportive conversation.
So great.
And like, if you have two students who are just reticent, they're not going to do anything, right? I generally try to pair more motivated students with ones who might need a bit more poking and prodding. And then in terms of level, I mean, I think generally I try to pair students who are not so far away in their level, because otherwise that'll lead to the higher level student getting frustrated and the lower level student might feel intimidated. And frustration and intimidation are the last things I want.
Yeah, I would say so, yeah. Pairing students for peer feedback activities is kind of like a bracket in playoffs, right?
Oh, okay, Shay.
Look at me referencing sports. Sports. You want the two to be fairly matched, right? Try not to pair extremes because generally speaking, it's just not going to be the best use of anyone's time. I also think beyond proficiency level and personality, you want to consider the student's comfort in this kind of task.
Sure.
Peer feedback is not something that's practiced everywhere in the world. Like in the US, we put a lot of emphasis on it. But in our ESOL context, we might be working with students coming from different places who haven't had this experience before. Like if you pair a student from South America with one from East Asia, you have really different approaches to providing feedback, different thoughts about what is appropriate to share with someone that might be considered critical.
Yeah.
Your student from South America might feel more comfortable engaging in that way, whereas the student from East Asia might need more time to get comfortable. They might even clam up initially. So we need to establish a shared classroom culture where students' opinions are relevant and valued, and so they know that it's okay to share a critique of someone else's work, since the purpose is to help them to get better, not just to point out flaws.
Right. So how do we set students up for successful peer review? How do we build that classroom culture from the start?
Well, I think the most pertinent piece is taking the time in class beforehand. Talk about what makes for good peer feedback. What does that look like? Maybe model something where you have a text or a short presentation that you show them, and then work together as a group to comment on the artifact.
Yeah, this is something I've skipped before and it never turns out well. Using a model, a sample of work from a previous student, something anonymous, something neutral as a starting point for providing feedback. Examining that model together is a great way to get that going to help students understand what they should be commenting on. And it also provides a chance to establish a set of rules, sharing expectations for how feedback should be given, right? You don't want them to just sort of go off and be disrespectful towards each other with heavy-handed critiques.
No, that's dangerous. And then this gets easier and easier as we have students practice peer review in our classrooms.
Yeah.
Going back to that idea of establishing a classroom culture, we've said it before and we'll say it again, I'm sure. Having an established routine, implementing the same or similar framework for feedback giving throughout the term builds that culture of respectful and constructive feedback giving.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you used this word routine. Peer feedback shouldn't be a one and done type of activity. That completely undermines the practice in my mind.
I agree. It's an iterative process and often long-term. This is not a skill that's developed overnight, nor will you be able to note that critical transference we've talked about right away. The more you do peer feedback, the more comfortable students will feel with it, and that's when you'll start to notice the shift.
Right. And you can't just do peer feedback on a singular final project. You want to make sure that you introduce this practice in a context that's a bit less high stakes. I remember there was this social media marketing class that I was teaching. It was a project-based course, and their whole task throughout the semester was to build a social media campaign. Now, even though this was a culminating project that they were working on, pretty serious for them and a big percentage of their grade, they received feedback at every step of the way, which made it feel more relaxed because it involved this sort of communal building. Everybody knew exactly what the other groups were working on, and they had a relationship about the work that they were doing. It wasn't always perfect feedback. They didn't always get exactly what it was that needed feedback at that moment in time, but they did learn a lot.
Yeah. I think ongoing peer feedback processes create an environment where there can be enthusiasm about others' growth and others' inquiries. I remember I did something similar in a project-based course where students were creating infographics about issues that exist in the world. Essentially, it was a research project that they were putting into an infographic form, which they would eventually share in a presentation. And students worked together in groups to support one another throughout the process. Each part of the infographic required something different, so they provided feedback to their group members every step of the way. So in their groups, each person would take on a responsibility for each phase of the project, and they would receive frameworks or checklists that asked them to look for very specific things in their partner's work. And when they noticed that there were, gaps or deficits in their partner's work, they would ask questions like, where could you find this information? And then the next time that they would get together, they would actually be curious as to whether their partners found the information that they had pointed out.
Nice.
So there was a certain amount of buy-in that was happening through the regular conferencing with their peers.
There's so many things popping into my mind right now. So first, you mentioned checklists. I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle, making sure that students know exactly what they're looking for in their peers' work. I always provide a checklist of what they should be looking for.
I agree it's important to provide a checklist, but actually, I don't always provide my own checklist.
What?
I know. I really love asking advanced students to create their own checklists for peer feedback.
Oh, wow.
Like, the students always know what I'm looking for as an end product because they look at rubrics before and during the process. But with advanced students, I'll have them use the rubric to create a framework to guide their peer feedback session.
Yeah, wow, that's super interesting. I've never tried that.
Yeah, I thought it was a cool reverse engineering activity, but it only worked because students were familiar with the peer feedback process by then.
Yeah.
They knew the end goal and understood all of the components required to achieve that end goal. This couldn't be done without a lot of preparation. Typically, I'll hand students some sort of narrative framework that asks them to look for really specific items in their peers' work.
Awesome. So we've talked about a lot, creating a culture around feedback, training students on good feedback etiquette, providing checklists. What we haven't discussed yet is the format of providing feedback. Normally, I put students in pairs and then give them time in class to review each other's work and then discuss their feedback in real time. Shay, you also mentioned earlier that during the research infographic project, your students provided feedback in groups. And the same went for the social media campaign feedback I had my students give each other. So we've got pairs and groups in synchronous feedback settings having a live conversation. What other formats can we hash out here?
Well, so for that same group I mentioned before with the infographics, the students actually held a gallery walk where they displayed their infographics in the university corridor and they stood in front of them ready to answer questions about their projects. During this time, students had checklists and provided feedback on their peers' final projects that they had seen evolve over the course of the semester. It was pretty awesome, and their pride was so obvious.
I love that. Yeah, a gallery walk is a great way for students to get more feedback from more peers and also to anonymize the process. Cult of Pedagogy recently posted an article about gallery walks for feedback on poetry, if anyone's interested.
Oh yeah, I saw that one.
Yeah, it was a nice example of how to implement a gallery walk. One of our listeners, Yulia, also brought up another interesting format. In her Twitter comment, she mentioned that she and her colleagues have found that asynchronous feedback using Voicethread works best for them. I don't know how many of our listeners have used Voicethread before, but I know you and I have, Shay, and we are huge fans.
Yeah, Voicethread allows students to leave voice or text comments on a shared presentation or document. Now, I've used Voicethread to model how to give feedback, but I haven't used it for one-on-one peer feedback yet.
No, me either, but I think it's a great solution. I've generally struggled with asynchronous feedback because I find that conversational negotiation of meaning element is often missing. Like if I ask students to write comments and send them back to their classmate. But I think Voicethread kind of solves that because they can sort of chat with each other back and forth more easily. And Yulia made a great point that when it's asynchronous, maybe students feel less pressure.
Yeah, that's a really great tip, Yulia. I'll have to try it. One last piece of this that I want to touch upon is whether after our students complete the peer feedback process, we need to provide feedback ourselves as the teachers, both to the individual whose work we're focusing on and to the reviewer on their quality of feedback. What do you think?
Well, I'm sort of a control freak, so I always feel the need to see what my students have worked on and redirect them. But I'm sure there are teachers out there who disagree with me, who think that peer reviews should be enough and that it's okay not to have teacher feedback at all times.
Yeah, I think if we are giving feedback, ideally there is either one-on-one conferencing or a conversation with all involved parties.
Right. But most of us don't live in that sort of classroom utopia, though, right?
Being such an idealist, yeah.
So maybe, we provide our own feedback and then we ask students to reflect on how the teacher's feedback differed from their peers' feedback.
Yeah, or at least, it definitely doesn't have the same effect, but typically I'll have a whole group reflection at the end of the process. Ask students to share what they got from their peers in terms of feedback, what they found particularly useful, how this process could be adapted to be more supportive, things like that.
Yeah, I think there's also a benefit in having the session end in a culminating shared experience. Not only does it reiterate the point that they're in this together, but having your students give their input only makes them more invested in the process, I think.
Yeah. So listeners, we've touched upon a lot of ideas today.
Oh, yeah.
And we realize that this topic might seem a bit abstract, particularly when we're talking about frameworks and checklists and rubrics. But Anna and I have so many resources that have worked well for us over the years, and we've actually decided to share them with you. If you've appreciated anything that you've heard here today, or if anything has piqued your interest, we've put together a resource packet with a wide variety of checklists and rubrics you can use, as well as our guidelines for students in peer review sessions. And we're selling it for a small fee on Teachers Pay Teachers.
We are excited to share something with you that comes from our classrooms.
And our hearts.
Our classrooms and our hearts.
Yeah, we think it'll be a nice, ready-to-use, or at least adaptable resource for you. But we still don't have all the answers. So, listeners, we want to hear from you. What is your top tip for facilitating peer feedback sessions?
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
For more resources related to today's topic, take a look at our website and our podcast Anchor page, anchor.fm/teacherthinkaloud. And to purchase our peer feedback resource packet, head over to teacherthinkaloud.com/support-us.
And thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.